Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Healthy Farms, Healthy People Coalition web forum. My name is Holly Calhoun. I'm the project coordinator of the Healthy Farms, Healthy People Coalition, which works to build cross-sector collaboration for policy reform that promotes the health of all Americans while supporting the economic and environmental viability of the food and agriculture sectors. Today, we bring you the first in a series of Healthy Farms, Healthy People Farm to School Month web forums with a focus on food safety. I encourage you to check out our website to learn more about our upcoming web forums. And today we're presenting the Farm to School Food Safety Project, which will cover legal and regulatory analysis, identification of resources, and education materials. This web forum is produced by the Colorado Farm to School Task Force, the Spark Policy Institute, the Colorado Foundation for Public Health and the Environment, and the Healthy Farms, Healthy People Coalition. Before introducing you to our panel of experts, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. And so here's a link to our website where you can find out more about our upcoming web forums, and we'll also be posting a link to a recording of today's web forum afterwards. So please do share that link with your colleagues that weren't able to join us today. We'd also like you to talk to us throughout the web forum and submit your questions. We've got some great panelists here with a lot of excellent information to share with you, and we want you to have the opportunity to ask some questions. So you have the Q&A box on the bottom right corner of your screen, and you can just type in your questions there. So to kind of warm it up and make sure everybody understands how to use the Q&A box, I'm going to ask you a question and ask you to just type in your answer there. So question is, what is your favorite fruit today? And it can be, we won't hold you to this for a lifetime, but go ahead and click in the Q&A box and type in your question, or answer, I should say. Fantastic. All right, so we've got, somebody's got apples, very seasonal. Excellent. I've been enjoying those a lot myself lately. Peaches, squash, delicious. I'm getting hungry. So glad to see that you can all use that box. Please, we'll be answering questions at the end, but there's no need to wait to type them in. Please enter them as they come to you, and we'll get to them at the end. So today, you'll hear a presentation on the Colorado Farm to School Food Safety Project by Lynn Kathleen of the Spark Policy Institute, Therese Filinetti of the Colorado Department of Public Health and the Environment, and Rick Ritter of the Otero County Health Department. New Rules for Local Public Health in Farm to School Food Safety by Danica Lee of the Department of Environmental Health in Denver, and Food Safety Issues, a School and Producer Perspective. Krista Garand from the Durango School District, and Mike Nolan from Mountain Roots Produce. Without further ado, I'll show you the faces that you'll be hearing from, and I'll turn it over to Lynn Kathleen on the Farm to School Food Safety Project.
Thank you, Holly. I really appreciate the opportunity to share the work that we did in Colorado. I want to let everybody know that while we are going to be certainly referencing Colorado work, as well as federal work and so on, that this is a project that has benefited our state a great deal, but it also is a great model for other states to undertake. And in fact, when we produced this project with the funding from the various funders that we will be thanking again at the end, we did this specifically to create resources to help other states undertake a similar analysis. So with that in mind, I want you to think about what you hear about when it's Colorado specific as, hey, we could do this in our state too, and be inspired to go ahead and do that. Next slide, please. Oh, you're on the right slide. Sorry, can you back up one moment? Thank you. I want to just give you the background quickly that this particular project was undertaken because we realized at the Colorado Farm to School Task Force that there were a number of food safety issues that were very confusing and daunting, as well as very important as it affected farm to school. And so these 5 questions really guided our work in this project. And those questions include looking at what are the federal, state, and local laws and regulations that are applicable to the food safety issues for farm to school. What are the guidance and trainings that are out there to support farm to school food safety? Were there any conflicts or confusions in the laws, regulations, guidings, and training? Do these guidings and trainings adequately address the farm to school food safety issues? And what changes do we need to make in our laws and regulations to better support it? Next slide. The first product that we are talking about here today is really what we call our kind of big major policy report. And it's intended for those people who have the authority to develop laws, regulations, rules, and training materials to facilitate farm to school food safety. So really this includes people who are policymakers, state agencies, public health officials, school food service directors, universities involved in public health, or agricultural food safety. Next slide. The types of federal laws and regulations that come into play with food safety and farm to school are a lot. So for example, we have FSMA, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act, which is currently undergoing a set of rulemaking right now. We have the current good manufacturing practices, the hazard analysis and risk-based preventative controls, and then at the school food level, we have the National School Lunch Act and the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010 that very much interfaces with food safety around sourcing locally. Next slide. There is also a whole lot of different guidance documents out there. The Food and Drug Administration has 7 specific food safety guidance. To date, each of these guidance documents have not been required, but rather are exactly what they are called, guidance. However, guidance practices are often adopted as required by state agricultural departments and state health departments and industry. Next slide, please. Industry itself has a strong interest in ensuring the safety of the food, and they have created additional guidance documents beyond FDA. Specifically, they have one on tomatoes, because tomatoes are a very difficult particular vegetable when it comes to food safety. And then they've become very involved lately in doing what they call the harmonized gaps, both for field operations and post-harvest. And this is really an industry-wide effort to make sure that all of the information is consistent and there aren't gaps in the gaps. Next slide. Then there is also the role of the state. So every state has laws and regulations on food safety. In Colorado, we have 4 specific that are implemented by our state and local public health departments. Colorado's Department of Agriculture actually relies on federal laws and guidance and does not have specific state laws on regulations around on-farm food safety. However, other states may differ on that. Next slide. For a moment, I'm going to hand it over to Rick, who's with our counties, to talk about the role of the counties.
Health Department. And I can tell you, I work at a local public health agency, and the role of the local public health agency in food protection is absolutely critical. What is our goal as we strive to protect food? Our goal is to reduce or eliminate foodborne risks and risk factors. Local public health agencies in Colorado inspect schools, restaurants, and other facilities, and we would inspect food hubs if they sliced and diced food, if they heated it, processed it, or prepared it in some way. Now this can be contrasted with farmers markets and roadside markets we see along the road. If they offer only uncut, fresh fruits and vegetables, if they're not processed or heated or sliced in any way, then they are exempt from the Retail Food Act, and local public health agencies would not inspect them. Well, what are the types of inspections that we do in the state of Colorado at the local level? Obviously, we do regular inspections. We get out on a routine basis and make sure restaurants and food facilities are doing what they're supposed to be doing. We do follow-up inspections if we find problems. We do pre-opening inspections. Before an establishment goes into business, we want to make sure that they're ready to do business in a safe way. And we respond to complaints from consumers. Now, during these inspections, what is looked at? We look at 8 critical categories of information to make sure that food is safe. First of all, food source. Is the food that they're getting and preparing from an approved food source? Is the food free of spoilage? Are there dangers from cross-contamination? We look at those issues. And we also make sure the establishment is looking at expiration dates and abiding by those. Another critical category is personnel. Do individuals have infections that restrict them from food preparation? If they have wounds, are those wounds properly covered? Are they following a good hand washing protocol? Are they following good hygienic practices? Do they demonstrate a knowledge that they can cook and understand cooking? And we make sure that they're not smoking, eating, or drinking in the food prep area. Another area of critical concern is food temperature control. Is the establishment rapidly cooling foods? Is it rapidly reheating them? Are they holding their food at a hot temperature correctly, at a cold temperature correctly? Do they have a food thermometer? Very, very important. Some other critical items that we look at are the sanitation of dishes, utensils, things of that nature. We look at water, sewage, and plumbing systems, hand washing and toilet facilities, pest control, and the last critical bit of information we look at are poisonous and toxic items. Are these properly stored, labeled, and properly used? Next slide, please. And Dr. Kathleen, were you going to share information on slide 15, the next slide?
Yes, on the food safety and education and trainings. We have identified in this project, we have identified a wide range of training and education materials. There are many national resources, and every state, like Colorado, likely has its own resources to train food service workers and farm workers on food safety. Next slide. The final thing about this policy report that I would bring out is that we actually, throughout the report, we identified key kind of findings and things to pay attention to. But we also identified at the end 6 major findings and recommendations. And this policy report provides an ability for our state to think about how they can move forward to do even better and coordinated farm-to-school food safety. Next slide, please. And with that, rather than read all of these recommendations, I encourage you at the end of this to take a look at our products that we have. And I'm going to be handing this over now to Therese to talk about the role for the state.
Polinetti. I'm with the State Health Department in Colorado, and I'm going to be talking specifically about how the Colorado State Health Department works with our local partners. So Dr. Kathleen had talked about the Colorado Food Protection Act and the Colorado Pure Food and Drug Law. Those laws are both in statute, and they provide the framework and the authority for Colorado to develop regulations that govern food safety. It also allows us to enforce those regulations through inspections, enforcement actions, follow-ups, things like that. And these regulations also determine what fees we charge for licenses and registrations for retail food establishments, which include grocery stores, restaurants, and school kitchens, as well as the wholesale food manufacturers that supply food to retail food establishments. So Dr. Kathleen also talked about 2 different regulations. There was a Colorado Wholesale Food Regulation and the Retail Food Establishment Rules and Regulations. The first governs the wholesale food manufacturer that, again, supplies retail food establishments, and the second governs those retail food establishments such as restaurants, grocery stores, and school kitchens. The law also provides Colorado Health Department the authority to delegate enforcement of those rules to our local partners in the state. And in Colorado, this may be the same in your state, we delegate our authority to many different local public health agencies. In fact, we have 64 counties in Colorado, sorry, I'm not advancing my slides. 64 counties in Colorado, 55 of those are covered by local public health agencies, and there are roughly 35 counties and district health departments that do all of that work. So they're doing the inspections, approval of facilities, licensing, that sort of work. We are there as the support for those counties, and we also do inspect 9 counties in Colorado that have not established a local public health agency to receive that delegated authority. So accepting raw agricultural products for a school kitchen is a great idea, but it is important to ask about whether or not those farms are using good agricultural practices so that you can assure that that produce is safe. You also need to assure that your school has the appropriate equipment in your kitchen to handle more raw and from-scratch cooking of produce. For example, in Colorado, we require a produce sink that's designated for washing and preparing produce. We also want to look for adequate storage and safe storage for the foods that you do prepare and serve. Also, a means of controlling and monitoring temperatures, particularly when you're preparing foods in advance. So in the course of research for this project, it's just become very clear that there are multiple state agencies in Colorado that do have authority over food safety as it relates to farm to school. And in addition, the types of authorities vary by agencies. So the outcome of that is that we put together, or this coalition put together, this 4-page document that you can see on the slide now that really kind of delineates who's responsible for what to help our farmers as well as our schools know who to go to for assistance with knowing how to follow the regulations, who's required to get what kind of license or registration, and also just general information about the recommendations for good manufacturing or good agricultural practices, excuse me. So as I've mentioned, the State Health Department does promulgate our regulations for retail food and wholesale food operators. We also delegate our authority to those 35 local public health agencies, but we do have one difference. In Colorado, the Denver Environmental Health Department was established before the State Health Department, and they actually have their own regulation. But other than that, every agency, locally and statewide, uses the exact same regulations for food safety at restaurants and in school kitchens and grocery stores. We do work very closely with Denver to assure that we're pretty consistent and we meet on a regular basis to ensure we're doing things similarly. So another thing I wanted to mention is that state law requires that we assure uniform application of our rules and regulations that we promulgate across the state. So this means that we're providing training regularly. We're also doing periodic inspections with inspectors across the state, just making sure that we're all on the same page, we're looking at the same things, we're enforcing in the same manner. We do something called standardization, which just verifies that everybody is applying the regulations consistently and correctly. And we actually have a person assigned to every local health agency in Colorado out of the State Health Department that helps them with technical questions and support. So we really do feel that in Colorado we have an amazing team of state and local food safety experts, and we very much encourage schools and farms in our area to make sure that they're working with these state and local partners as they start to bring fresh food and produce and more from-scratch cooking into their school kitchens. And I am going to pass it over now to Holly, I believe. Or no, I'm sorry, Rick Ritter.
Thank you, Therese. What you're looking at now are basically two different sources of law. The top two, the Colorado Food Protection Act and the Colorado Pure Food and Drug Law, are from statute, and the bottom two, the wholesale food regulations and the retail food establishment rules and regs, are from regulation. Now, our legislators get together and they make statutes that are later signed into law by the governor, and they go in the Code of Colorado, they go in Colorado Revised Statutes. Sometimes those statutes just don't have enough detail in them. And so the legislature has delegated authority to executive departments in this state to further those statutory agenda items by giving them the authority to promulgate rules and regulations. And for us in public health, that's through the State Board of Health. And so you can see, again, the top two are statutes, and the bottom two are regulatory guidance and rules and regulations. Now, what kind of ties this all together for local public health agencies is Colorado Revised Statutes 251506. And in that statute, that specifically deals with local public health agencies. It says the local public health agency's duty and obligation is to administer and enforce laws pertaining to public health and the orders, rules, and standards of the State Board of Health. And so that gives us the authority to enforce those laws that you see before you. Next slide, please. And we can take a look at a typical school kitchen in the state of Colorado. We see that nice, shiny stainless steel, no food particles anywhere, very clean. That's what we strive to accomplish when we do food inspections, and that's what we hope all of our kitchens, our retail food kitchens and school kitchens in the state will look like. You take a look now to the right, and it kind of looks dissimilar, doesn't look the same, but if that food hub slices and dices and cooks and prepares food, it will have a kitchen that will look similar to that, and it will be inspected just like school kitchens are by a local public health agency. And now I'll hand it off. We'll go to the next slide, and we'll hear from Dr. Kathleen.
Thank you, Therese and Rick. I really appreciate it. I want to point you now to a couple of what we tried to create in this project were some very targeted briefs that were what we like to think of as user-friendly and really just get down to what it is that our audience needs to know. And so we created two of what we call Just the Facts Please briefs. One is directed at school food service directors, and the other one is directed at agricultural producers. Next slide. The food service directors are important for ensuring food safety and farm-to-school programs. They have the responsibility of procuring fresh produce from sources that take appropriate food safety precautions, whether that is farms, processing facilities, or both. They're also responsible for ensuring that fresh produce arrives to them in good condition, free of contamination. Farm food safety at schools is especially important because they're serving school-age children, and school-age children tend to be more susceptible to foodborne illnesses than healthy adults. Next slide. This guide actually has three major sections to it. It provides a basic overview of the food safety requirements and recommendations that schools will need to address food safety in their farm-to-school programs. There are many resources available to help the school food service departments implement safe, fresh food preparation, and we also have examples from Colorado districts that are using food safety plans with their producers, and so other districts don't have to recreate the wheel. They can take a look at what's already being done. Next slide, please. This slide just shows some icons of the different types of resources that are available. We actually have nearly 50 food safety resources that are relevant to school food services when it comes to doing food safety for farm to school. Each of these resources in this brief has a succinct explanation of what it's about and its purpose and a hyperlink to it. Next slide, please. And in addition to the brief, which you can read and has hyperlinks in it, we also created an interactive web-based Prezi presentation of the same document. This visual presentation can be a good way to get a quick lay of the land and has hyperlinks to the most commonly used resources. Next slide, please. We did, of course, The second Just the Facts, Please is a guide for agricultural producers. It is without farm safety, we really are nowhere. So without those adequate safety practices, the human pathogens can easily find their way to fresh produce in the field. Small and mid-sized producers who want to expand their production beyond direct markets will need to either sell to wholesalers or retailers or directly to schools. And when they do that, they have to have some type of on-the-farm food safety plan. Next slide. Like the School Food Service Directors one, the Producer's Guide has 3 sections. This will provide everything they need to know to understand what are the main food safety issues that the schools are going to care about. It provides an overview of the regulatory environment as it affects on-the-farm food safety issues for schools. And then again, like the other one, it has resources. I might mention at this point that while it can seem really burdensome to the small and mid-sized producers to go into doing gap plans and so on, there was a study that was done by Colorado State University that found that the small and mid-sized producers, at least in our state, were implementing 90% of the good agricultural practices. They just were not documenting them. And so what this tells us is that now, of course, documentation is another level of time and effort, but it also tells us that the producers are doing what they need to do in order to meet the food safety standards that schools need. And so we'll provide resources to help them create those documentation plans so they don't have to do it all from scratch. Next slide, please. We have over 40 on-the-farm food safety resources that are included in this guide, and they're really directed at the small and mid-sized agricultural producers. Again, each resource is explained in a short little summary and is hyperlinked. Next slide. And of course, we have a presentation for producers too, and this is a good way for a producer to get a good sense of what is the lay of the land and what do they need to do and what are the resources they can use so that they can successfully enter the farm-to-school market and sell to our schools. Next slide. And this is just the titles of the different products that we created. You will have a hyperlink at the end here and in the resources that you will download probably in the next few days that will be available that will also give you access to all of these resources. Next slide, please. And now I would like to have Danica join us. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Danica Lee. I'm with the Denver Department of Environmental Health, and I manage our food safety section and inspections. And I'm going to share with you some information about the perspective of the local health department on some of these issues. Next slide. So I think it's important first to kind of establish the concerns that regulators have with produce. I think probably when you're on the regulated side, it can feel like there are a lot of regulations and it may be difficult at times to understand what those concerns are, especially when we think about produce. So when you look at foodborne illness outbreaks for the last few decades, we have seen an increasing number of those outbreaks that are nationwide outbreaks caused by produce, raw produce often. Most of the time when there is an outbreak associated with raw produce, that outbreak comes from a contamination event. So perhaps food becomes contaminated in the field, and then there's usually an element of temperature abuse, so foods are not maintained at the proper temperature after they've been sliced or prepared. Or the other scenario that's very common is a contamination event in the field with a viral contaminant, for example, fecal material getting on produce in the fields. You can see here the list of pathogens that are commonly associated with raw produce. And some of those pathogens, Listeria, especially and E. coli, can be deadly. And so that's sort of the context for some of the regulatory concerns. Next slide. So what we've seen, and again, this is the last 20 years or so, is a shift in where foods are coming from in the food supply. You can see this very busy, complicated graph on the left. And really what that is showing you is the complexity of our food supply. Produce over the last 20, 30 years has been sourced not just from all around the country, but from all around the world. So this little graph depicts where cantaloupes were sourced from in the year 1999. And you can see that they come from all over the place. And it's this type of complexity that contributes to some of the regulatory challenges when we do have an outbreak. And then on the right here, you can see some of the regulatory changes that have come along as we've learned more about how these outbreaks spread and as our epidemiological information and detection systems have improved. So in the 1990s, sprouts were termed what we call a potentially hazardous food, meaning that they have to be temperature controlled for safety from different types of outbreaks that were associated with those. And then in 2009, sliced tomatoes were deemed potentially hazardous foods, and that's because there were numerous instances of outbreaks, salmonella outbreaks associated with that product. With the latest revision to the Colorado state regs, and this corresponds with the FDA's food code, cut leafy greens are now determined to be a potentially hazardous food, again requiring that they be temperature controlled after they've been sliced and prepared. And so what you tend to see over time is regulatory changes that correspond to some of the science that we're learning about how illnesses spread. There has been a lot of self-regulation in the produce industry, and there's also been a lot of regulatory attention and oversight as we've learned more about these large outbreaks in the last 20 years. Next slide. However, the health departments tend to think about all of these outbreaks and all of the concerns, but we really need to think about the benefits to raw produce and the availability of it. Compared to the frequency with which raw produce is consumed, it is very safe. Raw produce from a local garden is even safer in most cases, and you can implement many good food safety practices in your operation to get further safeguard the foods that are being sourced. So it's very important from the local health department level when we're working with schools or other operations that are pursuing these types of programs to keep in mind all of the good public health benefits associated with facilitating these programs. Next slide. So I'm going to speak for just a minute or two about the development of several programs in Denver. In 2009, Denver Public Schools approached our agency, and again, my agency is the one that's conducting the regular food safety inspections of these kitchens, and they wanted to talk to us about the possibility of starting up what they called a garden to cafeteria program, which would consist of schools starting up gardens on their grounds and using those gardens to teach children about how to grow the produce, how to harvest the produce, and then those foods would go into the school kitchens. So we started meeting with Denver Public Schools, also with Slow Food Denver, which is a local chapter of a great national organization. And my agency played a consultative role on the food safety pieces of the policy development. The regulations that we enforce do not apply to the field, produce growing in the field. So we really acted in a very consultative manner for those pieces of the policy. And then our food safety regulations do come into play once the produce enters the kitchen. And so we made sure that the protocols that were being developed were not just consistent with complying with our regulations, but also that we were recommending practices that would help facilitate compliance. So for example, if a school is going to be setting up a salad bar and is going to have sliced produce on that salad bar, it is important to keep much of that produce at cold temperatures while it's on the salad bar. Now, if you're bringing in produce that hasn't been refrigerated and you're slicing it up that day and sticking it on a salad bar, it's going to be difficult to maintain food temperatures. So one of the recommendations that was implemented in the protocols was to slice foods in advance of placing them on the salad bar, refrigerate them, allow them time to cool off, and then stock them on the salad bar. So really trying to work with them to identify practices that would help facilitate their compliance. Next slide. Some of the focus of the food safety precautions in the protocols that were developed for the garden to cafeteria protocols was how harvest equipment is handled, making sure that harvest containers do get some type of routine cleaning, restricting ill children and food handlers because that is a big risk factor for the contamination of food. Encouraging hand washing and actually requiring hand washing in the protocols, making sure that produce gets washed once it comes into the kitchen, and also that it gets a field wash after being harvested if there's large chunks of soil and debris still attached to it. Refrigerating the produce after harvesting, which is really above and beyond the regulations in most cases with whole uncut produce. However, again, getting that produce chilled right after harvest is going to help facilitate compliance down the road in the preparation practices. Denver Public Schools was also great about volunteering supervision of the salad bar. So as you can imagine, letting a bunch of 10-year-olds loose around the salad bar may not always result in the best practices. And if, for example, kids drop tongs on the floor or sneeze on food, there is somebody, a school staff member, who's overseeing that and switching out those tongs or switching out any food that may have been contaminated. And then finally, cleaning and sanitization of kitchen equipment as well. Next slide. So from the bigger perspective, I mentioned the fact that sometimes with local public health, we get a little bit siloed in the fields that we're in, and we get a little bit blinded by all the possible concerns that there might be that could cause illness. And so it is very important for health agencies to keep in mind the bigger public health perspective. So food safety and food safety regulations are a component of environmental health and a component of public health. And when we look at the real big picture with public health, we have an obesity epidemic and we have other community health issues that that are addressed and improved by implementing programs like this. So we see an increase in physical activity when people are working in gardens, an increase in healthy eating. It's amazing what the kids would try when they had played a role in growing or harvesting some of these vegetables. Strengthening of communities, teaching new skills, encouraging habits that are greener, and even stimulating local economies. Denver Public Schools actually, when they have surplus food, because they do farm some of the land that they own, they farm it separately from just the gardens at the schools, they actually sell these foods at farmers markets and invigorate local economies. It's been very clear to us here in Denver, and I think in the state of Colorado, that the benefits of the school garden programs outweigh the risks. And I will briefly say before I wrap up my piece here that in addition to the garden to cafeteria protocol, Denver Public Schools in 2010 also developed their farm to cafeteria protocol. And I believe those protocols will be available for sharing after the webinar today. Next slide. Krista or Mike, are you there?
Here. Am I unmuted? Okay. So on the next slide.
So I'm the food service director in Durango, and I've been here for 8 years. And in Durango, we started our Farm to School program in 2006. Back then, there wasn't a lot of guidance or resources to help navigate the ins and outs of having a Farm to School program. On the next slide, you can see how we chose to define local. The USDA Geographical Preference now allows schools to define local and purchase locally. So due to our proximity to state lines, we didn't want to limit ourselves to a 45-mile radius to stay within the state of Colorado. So we chose a 250-mile radius, so our definition of local now spans into multiple states. Even though this spans into multiple states, our purchases are currently coming mostly from La Plata and Montezuma County, but all within the state of Colorado. On the next slide, it became apparent after some time that more stringent protocols would need to be in place. And the only way that we felt this would occur successfully was educating farmers and food service directors on how each side works and why. We needed everyone speaking the same language. The next slides are a glance at our Southwest Farm to School Conference. So I developed the Southwest Farm to School Conference with assistance from Real Food Colorado, and the next slide will show you some of the paperwork we put out on that conference. So that conference focused on educating farmers on school food safety and how to develop food safety plans for their farms. With input from small local farms, ag educators, and myself, a self-assessment checklist was developed based on good agricultural practice. The checklist was developed with the practices that we thought would be reasonable for small farmers to put into place. The conference gave the farmers the opportunity to give input into the checklist and let them start to understand what would be expected of them if they wanted to participate in a farm-to-school bid. So the following slides are examples from that checklist. So the top portion, we felt it was important to get personal and farm information, and we gave them the opportunity to check a box that allowed us to know whether they were interested in participating in school field trips out to their farms, but also letting us know if all products they were selling were coming from their farm. We used sections on personal hygiene, water, animals and livestock, and on the next slide, traceability. So we wanted to know that products were being delivered and clearly labeled with dates of harvest, and that documentation was being done on the farm side. And field, harvest, and transportation, washing and packing. So we're asking questions like, are you testing your water? When was it tested? Those kinds of things. So from this self-assessment, a small farmer could easily develop a farm food safety plan. They simply elaborate on any item they answered within this checklist to create that plan. When a farmer responds to our local bid, this checklist is required, and it gives me the ability to see their food safety practices at a glance and provides me a guideline for when I do a farm visit. With multiple education efforts in the 2 counties, we now have all of our farmers responding to our bid with this checklist and a completed food safety plan. So prior to the conferences, we had a lot of our small farmers didn't even know what a food safety plan was. So the process was very successful. And now you're going to hear from a farmer perspective with Mike, who's been, we've been successfully purchasing from for several years and also follows these protocols.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Mike Nolan with Mountain Ridge Produce. I've been selling to Durango 9R for about 3 years. I'm going to get through this because it's about 12:53. I've got harvest, post-harvest, washing, packing, transport, and then records and labeling. Everything here has 2 goals. The first is to prevent anything from going wrong from the time of harvest to the time of delivery. But the other main goal is also so we have a degree of traceability in all the product that's coming into the school district, but also going into restaurants and other wholesale accounts. A lot of these protocols are based on GAP standards for raw veggies, though I mainly do storage crops, beets, potatoes, winter squash, onions, and etc. So when it comes to harvest, some of the main things I try to follow, and a lot of the other growers in the area try to follow, is harvesting early in the morning when it's cool, so you're not trying to deal with field heat in the veggies. Sanitation in the field of knives, buckets, and other harvest materials with a bleach solution. Having good records, and this is key for everything, both just for me personally as a grower, but So we can basically have some standards going in from the harvest all the way to the delivery, and that's knowing when you planted, fertilized, organic or not, last time the tractor was in the field, who's been on the farm, who hasn't been on the farm, etc. Sanitation of farm equipment. This is good for the soil, but also good for produce health in general. One big thing is fencing, so we don't have deer, elk, and other things running through the field. Water testing. I try to do it 3 times a year, spring, summer, and fall. And part of that is also knowing what your water source is. Is it lake water, river water, ditch water, where it's coming from, and knowing what times of year during monsoon season or otherwise there could be an issue. Another big one is personal sanitation for everyone on site. And this is a big deal. Washing hands, also having clean clothes, not wearing the same dirty farm clothes every single harvest day, because produce can touch your pants, can touch your clothes. And having people wash their hands prior to coming onto site and after using the restroom, smoking, drinking, anything like that, and to not use hand sanitizer. Really need hot water and soap for this sort of thing. From this step on, there's a conscious effort to maintain the temperature of the product from the time of harvest through the delivery. So when it comes to post-harvest, pretty simple. Good transport from the field, and by good transport it means clean transport, and having clean buckets, new wax boxes, clean truck, shade, all that. So you're not having any temperature fluctuations or anything that could happen to the product between the field and the post-harvest station. And some growers around here, they're going 100 feet, some are going a half mile, some are going 3 or 4 miles from their farm site to their post-harvest site. Washing. Always clean. We always clean the station after harvest and before the harvest. Our station has stainless steel for the most part. There is some washing tubs, chicken wire, all that stuff gets washed before the harvest and also at the end of the day. So basically twice in between, 2 times in between washing sessions. Having some sort of like good commercial grade plastic, having good commercial grade hose, and basically that is so there's no lead coming in for because a lot of the garden hose has lead in it. So we use pretty expensive commercial grade hose for delivering water to the wash station. And one big thing is potable water. Access to potable water is kind of a big deal. There's some growers that have a hard time accessing potable water, so a lot of us haul water. And when we have questionable water or potable water that we might not know exactly what's going on, we use bleach. And bleach is a pretty big standard around here for basically cleaning anything, and also any veggies that are going into water, it's going into bleach water. We ran into an issue this fall with all of that rain we had and how muddy everything was. So we were doing brief soaks of product before actually spraying it down, and doing basically triple washing things with 2 bleach waters per washing cycle. Let's see. Once again, clean hands, clean clothes, and then one thing to do all the way through that we try to follow is culling of product. Anything that's damaged, diseased, cut, not up to standard, it gets tossed and thrown away, so it does not make it in the box going to the wholesale delivery. When it comes to packing, same thing as kind of the transport in and out of the field. New bags, new plastic. If we do reuse wax boxes, they're organic wax boxes, and they're lined with 2 mil plastic on the inside for delivery. And this is where labeling comes in, and records labeling is the bottom bit. At this point, every single box, bag, whatever it is, has my farm name, the date harvested, the date processed. If I'm pulling something out of a root cellar, it's going to have the date it went to the root cellar and also the date where it was washed and processed after, and then the field it came out of. And what this does is bring that degree of traceability up. So if anything does happen, it's not just, okay, we know it's from my farm. I actually know what part of the field, what part of the root cellar, and we can actually nail it down and see if there is a problem. And then transport. Clean car, clean truck. Pressure wash the back out, having an enclosed space or a cover on it. And coolers can be really handy. I try to do stuff day of. I usually don't use coolers. But I usually have things tarped, and the tarps are bleached and cleaned prior to covering the produce for transport, and I've got about a 30-mile drive round trip to get to the school district and back. So in general, records and labeling are huge. We need to have everything written down, know where things are coming from, know where they're going, what field they came out of. But to really go back to one more point, when it comes to all these things, it's challenging for some of the small growers to meet these. But with the gap plans and the things Chris has been working on, even if we do have gaps in our gap plan, we now have the ability to mediate those and be able to fix them and work on them and process them so we can still make the food safe in schools. So that's all I have to say. What are we doing? I think we're passing it on to Lynn.
Hi, this is Holly. I just want to do a quick wrap up and then we can get to some more question and answers. I know some of the panelists have been answering questions in the box there, so that's great, but I do want to give a few moments for us to be able to discuss some of these. So the slide here has speaker contact information. Please do take this down, and again, we will be posting this presentation on our website, but if there's anybody that you'd like to get in touch with afterwards for more questions, please write these names down, and I'll come back to these resource slides when we're going through the answering Q&A so you can have time to write them down. So here are some resources from the Farm to School Food Safety Project. I'd also put the link up in the chat box when Lynn was presenting, and some more of the checklist and the garden food safety protocol resources. We also have the Prezi template resources here for Farm to School Food Safety. So these are the interactive templates that Lynn referred to that you can play around with on the website there. And I also want to just mention that this project by the Spark Policy Institute, the Colorado Farm to School Task Force, and the Colorado Foundation for Public Health and the Environment is part of a series funded by the Healthy Farms, Healthy People Coalition through a CDC cooperative agreement administered by the National Network of Public Health Institutes. ChangeLab Solutions provided technical assistance for the series. The views and opinions of these authors and organizations are not necessarily those of CDC or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So without further ado, I would like to open it up for some of the questions that have been coming through. So one that we had is, I know that GAP standards were mentioned at one point in the presentations, and I think this might be for Danica, but if other folks want to speak to it, please go ahead and chime in. The question is, do you have data that shows how many produce outbreaks came from GAP or non-GAP certified farms, or data that would suggest the size of the farm more likely associated with food safety outbreaks?
This is Danica. You know, I am probably not the best person to speak to that question. I do not have any data like that, nor do I deal with the GAP information very much. So is there another speaker who would feel more comfortable responding to that?
Hi, this is Lynn. So I'm not going to be able to tell you a lot except to say that this is a really great question. In the state of Colorado, we certainly don't have any indicators that our small farms that are not GAP certified are involved in any extra food safety problems. But this is actually a much bigger question that people are asking as these produce rules for FSMA are getting rolled out. You know, to what degree do these smaller farms, you know, are there practices such that are problematic that they need to have the heavy hand of regulation on them? And the only other thing I would say is that what we do know is that of all of those small farms that CSU, Colorado State University, examined, they were already putting in place GAP practices. They just were not documenting them. So they were doing all those different kinds of things that Mike talked about, but they didn't have a checklist. essentially, that was showing that they were doing those.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Another question we have, and I believe this one came through when Mike was, or not Mike, I'm sorry, when Rick was speaking. You mentioned that during inspections you determine whether or not facilities are using approved food sources. What are approved food sources?
Hi, and this is Rick, and that would be a question for my Environmental Services Program Director. I'm the Executive Director of the agency. I actually serve as her backup when she's gone, and thank goodness for mobile phones because I do engage her when she is away if I have questions. Danica, when we're talking about approved food sources, could you speak to that?
This is Danica, and yes, I can speak to that. So an approved source would be a source that complies with state, local, and federal food safety laws. And in the case of most foods, this means that they're manufactured in a licensed, inspected facility. So if we have a school kitchen, we want to make sure if they're getting canned foods or prepared foods, that those are coming from an inspected manufacturer. In the case of produce, there has certainly been a shift in recent years so that in the state of Colorado right now, produce, provided it's whole and uncut, can be obtained from many sources, from everything from farms, like you might think of, to small growers. In Denver, we do allow restaurants to obtain whole, uncut produce from even backyard growers, although we put a lot of emphasis with the regulated facility on knowing the source of their foods. So trying to make sure that they're not getting garden produce from, you know, the cat lady who has 20 cats wandering around her backyard, and to make sure that they have obtained or they've talked to their supplier about things like soil testing. And the only other requirement we have for any of our regulated food facilities that are obtaining produce from these sources is that they have some type of tracking mechanism so that in the event of an outbreak, we would be able to conduct traceback. So essentially, we ask them to have some type of invoice or receipt for the products. And Therese, please feel free to add on if I've left anything out there.
So it looks like nobody has anything to add, unless.
Well, I was muted until just now. I was just going to concur. I thought, Danica, you did a good job giving that overview. I would agree completely with what you said.
Great, and then a few questions about school garden produce came through just before that was really focused on in the presentation. So it looks like those have been addressed either through the presentation or in the chat box. So it looks like, yes, there were some protocols developed which the school district had asked for. So just looking for, there's a few more questions here. Here's one that says, I think it would be a good practice to document, this is a follow-up, to document about the CND staff recommending safe handling practices. So there's been some back and forth in the Q&A box. I'm wondering if maybe someone wants to speak to that in a way that could inform the other listeners on the calls. Looks like, Danica, you've been kind of going back and forth here about harvesting and for the CND centers and coming through cafeterias compared to teachers?
So yeah, I did comment on some of this, although not on the question that referred to CND because I'm not familiar with that acronym. Do you know what CND stands for?
I'm guessing from the kind of like child, let's see if maybe if somebody could type that.
Child Nutrition Directors, it looks like here. Thank you so much for the comment. So the statement was that in this particular state, the Child Nutrition Director staff are recommending that the staff do not handle garden produce You know, I'm not aware of any hard and fast evidence relating specifically to school staff handling produce. However, there is plenty of evidence supporting that good, safe practices, precautions, and protocols reduce the risk of an illness event associated with produce. And so I would encourage an entity that's interested in implementing a program like this to draft and create some policies and procedures that speak to the hygiene issue, speak to how food is stored and handled. And this is where, if you look at the Denver Public School garden to cafeteria policies that I believe Dr. Kathleen will be making available after the webinar today, you'll see really specific procedures in there that speak to all of these things. When you have procedures in writing and when the staff are trained on them and when there's some documentation component, that may very well assuage some of the concerns that you might be encountering with school staff members conducting some of the produce handling. And I also want to emphasize that in Denver, the kids are harvesting the produce too. So we're really, the procedures that we have are really ramped up around ensuring good hygienic practices, excluding ill children and that type of thing.
And this is Lynn Kathleen, and I would like to just add that we have an upcoming webinar in this series on October 28th. That's called Food Safety, Urban Farming, and Farm to School. And I actually think this would really provide you with a lot of information about a very, I think, very cutting-edge program that Denver Public Schools is putting in place, and we are, Spark Policy Institute, is the evaluators for this program. And so coming out of that is going to be the evidence that, you know, food service directors can definitely handle school garden produce safely coming out of not just school gardens, but in this case, farming schools. Denver Public Schools is piloting farming their own land that's not being used for anything else. So it's a really great webinar to listen to answer that question and just to hear a real cutting-edge program happening.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Lynn, thank you. And so we are right at time, and I think we have gotten to most of the questions, but I do have the speaker contact information up here if you do want to follow up with questions. I appreciate that last reminder that this is the first in a series of webinars, and so we will be going into more depth on some of these issues in our subsequent webinars, which are listed on our website, which I just posted up in the chat box, hfhpcoalition.org. That is also where we will make sure to make available all of the resources that were mentioned in today's web forum. And if we have missed any questions, please, or you think of anything in the future, please let us know and we'll be happy to answer them. I want to give a big thank you to all of our presenters today. You're all doing fantastic work getting food safely to students in Colorado and teaching us how we can do that in other states as well. So thank you so much, and thanks to all the participants for taking time out of your day to join us. I hope you'll be able to join us on a future web forum, and I hope that you'll be able to implement some of these great practices in your own districts. Thanks so much. Have a great day, everybody.